The views and opinions expressed on this show are purely the views and opinions of the person who made them and do not necessarily reflect or agree with those of the show's commercial sponsors, its radio station affiliates, or internet broadcast platforms. As the restriction on our God-given right to free speech manifests itself throughout the world, we are inspired by Jesus Christ's immortal words, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And we reserve the rights to all our words. Thank you, and now enjoy the show.
To learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticise. You are listening to ACH. I'm Andy, your host, and before I introduce today's show, I'd like to thank an unknown person for their donation of $22. I got it into the bank, but it had no details on it, so whoever you are, thank you so much for that. Today is show 1200, and I'm delighted to be welcoming on a new guest, a man whose work I've appreciated for a very long time. He should be quite familiar to all of you in the alternative media. He is Frank Raymond. I'm going to bring him up right now. Frank, are you with me?
Yes, sir, I am.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you on board. I've heard you on several shows and your work is outstanding. You speak from a very unique perspective. You've got a book that's available to people. There will be a link to that in the post for this show. It is called Sweet Dreams and Terror Cells. So folks, go to places like Amazon. You can get it on there if you're listening and you're not getting it off the download, so you don't get the direct link. It's very easy to find. Sweet Dreams and Terror Cells by Frank Raymond. But Frank, because it's your first time on the show, I always ask a new guest if they would like to go into their background for the audience in as little or as great a detail as they would like. So please take us through that.
Well, I'll give it in as little detail as possible because we have a short time to cover a big topic. I believe that people who are inside a system, even two people in a marriage, can't see things clearly because they get used to, they accept as normal things that are not really normal. And white people, certainly under occupation and mind control, have come to accept their plight as normal. An outsider sees things more clearly, and I'm an outsider. I'm not white. I was not born in the West. I was born in India. And therefore, I bring that perspective, and we say things like, well, we Indians aren't giving up our country to alien hordes. Why the hell are white people? What's wrong with them? So that's the perspective I bring. And you mentioned my book. My book is meant to really attack it from that perspective, to say, this is obvious, for God's sake, people. Why do you not see the obvious? And my book is meant to be a primer and a one-volume coverage of the entire spectrum of the issue of the vast canvas of the dispossession of whites and their planned extinction. It's meant to be sort of a comprehensive account that covers all the issues, maybe not in enough detail, but anyone who gives it to a liberal will find that if the liberal reads through the book, their mind will change. And what is a liberal? A liberal is a white who has been brainwashed or mind controlled to desire the demise and destruction of their race and to worship the almighty alien. That's what a liberal is. That's basically why I wrote the book, to give a fresh outside perspective and to start the process of questioning in liberals, to ask themselves the simple question, has someone been messing with my mind? Why am I thinking in this insane, lunatic lemming way? So that's basically my background. Was there any issue that you wish to discuss before we plunge into the main topic?
No, Frank, that was very, very interesting, and as I say, your perspective is just quite unique because when you get people of other backgrounds than white backgrounds who are talking on issues such as this, I'm not aware of anybody who actually speaks up for the situation regarding white people and their indigenous homelands being essentially taken from them by the promotion not of the other races themselves but of actual white people or people, controlling their narrative, shall we say, promoting this what they call diversity, which is a nonsense, because what they actually want is to mix everyone up together so you just get one mixed race at the end of the day. So that basically eliminates all diversity. From your background in India, how do people, I mean, you made the point there that in India they don't tolerate this sort of thing. I understand in places like China they don't either. They run their countries for their people. But what's the sort of is there a sense of nationalism in India, a national pride? Certainly, I follow the cricket and things like that, and there's even in the UK, people of Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi heritage will always root for their own teams of their indigenous team, shall we say, even if they're second or third generation in the UK. What is the feeling of nationalism in India?
Well, in India, nationalism is racial nationalism, and India is a very divided country with many races, and they're at odds with each other. But taken together, they also have a nationalism of us vis-a-vis the world. Any Indian regards a Chinese person as an alien. A Northern Indian might accept a Southern Indian. They're very different, they speak different languages. But there is an all-encompassing Indian collective, and it is us vis-a-vis, not against, not versus, us vis-a-vis the world. So if there were a famine in China and 50 million Chinese wanted to move to India, they'd say no. And they'd say the same for Arabs. The only people today who are not ethnically conscious are the whites, and that's because there's an alien people that has seized power and wishes to remove the whites. Now, you mentioned all this talk about diversity, that people are told about diversity and multiculturalism. Well, I have a reply to that. There was a ditty during the Vietnam War, and I'm going to adapt that little ditty. Okay? You bring your coloreds in, you push my children out. You take the white girl's mind and you twist it all about. So choke my nose with garlic, stuff my ears with butter, fill my mouth with pepper, tell me lies about diversity.
Yes, it is crazy. I mean, I can't understand it myself. It's got nothing to do with hatred or anything like that. I fight for the rights of all people to protect their own culture and heritage. And what's the point in travelling and things like that and going to different cultures if suddenly it's all the same wherever you go? It just removes what the world is. It just ruins it and gets rid of people's heritage and culture, and it's really quite appalling. What's your what do you say to people how they can resist this? Let's get into the main topic that you have planned for today.
Well, just one sentence before that. As I make very clear in my book, Sweet Dreams and Terror Cells, and as I conclude, this is not about diversity, it's not about multiculturalism, it's not about racial oppression, it's not about discrimination. All these are blinds and swindles. All these are tools. The main issue is only one, that there is a program to colonize white lands, dispossess white peoples, and eventually genocide them. The white people are losing their lands and therefore their right to live in a society of their own, and they're losing their very biological existence. They are being colonized as surely as the whites once colonized the native Indians, okay, and set up their population in North America. They're being colonized as surely as the Mongols once came to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, killed the local people and settled the land. This is a process of dispossession, colonization, and genocide. So forget all the talk about diversity and any debate about whose IQ, which race has a higher IQ. Just say, this is my country. I don't care if Jamaicans have a higher IQ. I don't care if every mestizo is a Cellini or a Michelangelo. Let them be Cellinis in their country. Leave me alone in my country. Just stick to that. My country, my land, my people. Stick to that and don't get swindled or taken off into different debates and different directions. Those are all meant to distract you from the main issue. So let's talk about the fact that whites are not only slated for extermination, that's the ultimate. Let's talk about the fact that whites don't realize it, many whites don't, but they are an occupied people and they act like an occupied people. So let's talk about this occupation. Is that okay with you?
Yes, Frank, please go ahead.
Now, there are three classes of occupation. There is just a simple occupation. An elite rules another population. And the ruling class, maybe an alien ruling class, keeps the masses suppressed by terror and exploits them. Case in point, the Normans occupied the Saxons. Yeah. Then there's a second kind of occupation where there is an elite occupation, but they also inject alien colonists onto the land. The English, for example, when they ruled Ireland, they injected Scottish and Anglo colonists mainly into Northern Ireland. The Bolshevik Jews, when they invaded Estonia, they promptly pushed in aliens into Estonia to break up its ethnic composition and to render the Estonians weak. Estonia has never been a unified nation state since, and it's still plagued by racial division. It's no longer a unified nation state, one that cannot be ruled. The Jew Bolsheviks pushed in so many Russians and other peoples that now 40% of Estonia is alien. That's the kind of occupation you're facing. There's an injection of alien colonists, as you see. Ireland seems to be becoming a colony of Nigeria. Then there's the worst form of occupation where there's an alien occupation. There is an injection of alien colonists, but there's also total genocide of the native people or the founding people. And that is what you're up against right now, a process that intends a total genocide of whites. And we are seeing that in part. Large parts of the United States are lost to whites, but it's spreading. The cancer is spreading, and it's time for white people to realize that they are an occupied people. Now, why do I say you're an occupied people? Well, occupation has certain markers. There are certain characteristics of every occupation, and I'd like to just run through them one by one. Any questions at this point?
No, I find this very interesting. Let's go through that. The only thing that I would raise is, of course, we see a lot of these people that we refer to who really don't like being referred to. And when you look at people like, say, Barbara Lerner Specter and her infamous video that leaked out onto the internet where she said that Europe is not going to be these, ethnically white, paraphrasing now, societies they once were, they're going to go into multicultural mode. The question that a lot of people ask is why these people are so keen to target white people, why they hate white people so much, because they're not doing the same thing, as you say, as you said earlier, with your knowledge of India and Pakistan and what have you, even though they've got different cultures, different languages, different things there. They're not worried about pumping other people into their societies, but they're only concerned with whether you're in one part of the world, Australia, or if you're in Canada or the UK, if it's white, it needs to be multiculturalized. And I wondered if you had any views as to why that is.
Well, that's an issue that I did think about quite a bit. And that's why I say that when people say globalists, when they say the enemy is the globalists, they're wrong. The enemy does not want to rule the entire globe. They have no intention of ever multiculturalizing China or ruling India or Japan. It's only the white countries they're after. Therefore, the term globalists is a misleading term. The sneak rulers, let's call the enemy the sneak rulers, they want the white countries and only white countries. And there is a good reason for that. And this is not we have only an hour, and so I won't go into it here. But read chapter 7 of my book. It is dealt with explicitly, where a certain Professor David Butler lays out exactly why it is the whites and only the whites that have to go. And at the end of the day, the sneak rulers want to be the only white and fine-featured, beautiful people on earth. But the details are given in chapter 7 of my book, which specifically deals with this issue. It's a big issue. We can't deal with it today. So I just refer people to chapter 7, very specific adumbration of that topic, okay?
That's absolutely fine, Frank, and thank you for that. So please continue where you were with describing what's going on.
Well, in any occupation, the subject people are exploited. Now, here's a very obvious exploitation. The Zionist lobby exploits America mercilessly. It's not just a matter of giving a few $1 billion to Israel as official government aid. In fact, they give about $1.5 billion or more to Egypt and to Jordan. That money doesn't really go to Egypt and to Jordan. It's meant to bribe them so that they suppress the Palestinians. The Egyptians specifically blockade the Palestinians. They prevent any food or weapons from reaching the Palestinians. They blockade the Palestinians from the Egyptian border. The Palestinian resistance digs tunnels and tries to get through. The Egyptian authorities stop that. The Jordanians blockade the Palestinians on the eastern side, on the river Jordan, I believe. And they're paid to do that. That money, really, that $1.7 billion to each of these countries is going for the Zionist lobby. And American people have to pay it, and they have no choice. But there are, of course, other extortions, like paying for the Iron Dome defense of Israel. And in the defense contracts, huge amounts of money go out. The American people are being exploited by the Zionist lobby. They have to pay for Israel and its endless wars. And they paid for the Iraq war, which was fought primarily to strengthen Israel in the Middle East and splinter the Middle East into anarchic statelets over which Israel can dominate and expand. That's a huge exploitation of the American people, trillions of dollars, much blood and treasure. Subject peoples are exploited, and the Americans are exploited by the Zionist lobby. But they're exploited in other ways, these subject people, the subject whites. There's a huge transfer of wealth to black people and to mestizos. And so American family, the average middle-class family, has to work 2 jobs now. Whereas at one time it was enough for the dad to work. Now, even with the husband and wife both working, they can't make ends meet. And a large part of their tax money goes to blacks and mestizos who get what they call EBT cards, electronic bank transaction cards. And in fact, those people have lots of babies. They pay to be outbred and genocided, basically. So they are being exploited, and there's not much they can do about it. They even have to pay for the new colonizers crashing the border. Mestizos are coming through the Mexican border in their millions, and they have to be housed. They have to be fed. They have to be given daycare and this and that. And guess what? The white American doesn't like the fact that these millions are coming in, but he pays for the border patrol that administers it. He pays for the highly paid judges that look at their fake asylum cases. And then the mestizos complain, our conditions are not good enough. You're not feeding us well enough in these border camps. Yeah? Now, that comes out of the pockets of the whites, and they have to actually pay for for the invasion of their border. That's pretty ridiculous. But subject peoples are always exploited. And this brings up an interesting issue, that the occupied people are always forced to pay for their occupation. When the Roman Empire ruled Britain, Gaul, and Asia meant modern-day Turkey, it forced the occupied peoples to feed, house, and arm the Roman armies and the administrators. The whites of the USA have to pay for all the apparatus of security and repression and spying and surveillance that is upon them. They have to pay for the FBI, the fusion centers, the Homeland Security, the NSA that spies upon every American and represses any white nationalist movement. That includes the militias and the oath keepers. There was once a strong militia movement, and it was the spearhead of the white awakening and the white nationalist movement. But then there came the Oklahoma false flag bombing, and that was a false flag bombing. It was carried out by some secret unit of the government. Overnight, it destroyed the militia movement, the budding militia movement. Now, American taxpayers paid for that. They had to pay for the occupation and the repression of their people. And of course, when you see any occupation, there is a vast apparatus of suppression, and the occupied have to pay for it. In every case, the police are tasked to do the political protection of the rulers and of their rulers' programs. In any third world country, the army rulers, or whatever other dictatorship sits there, they put the police on the front line. They don't put the army on the front line to arrest demonstrators or to arrest dissidents. They put the police on the front line. And in the United States, for example, guess what? The FBI, which should be a crime enforcement agency, has been tasked to find political dissidents, to spy on them, to arrest them, prosecute them. In Canada, the police have a unit called the Hate Crimes Unit, which hounds any white nationalist who dares to open his mouth. They arrested a man called Arthur Topham, actually drove all the way from Vancouver to northern BC to arrest this man. So always in an occupation, the occupiers, they task the police, the law enforcement people, to do their political bidding, and that's what's happening in all these white countries. And of course, there's a vast apparatus of suppression in any occupied country. In the US, there are 17 intelligence agencies they disclosed. Now, that happened when they said that the Russians interfered in the elections. And they said 17 intelligence agencies have confirmed that the Russians have interfered in the election that brought Donald Trump to power. Well, most people must have jumped and said 17, I'm being exploited and paying for 17 intelligence agencies. And then up came this Homeland Security. I was rather surprised some 7 years ago. I was in California at a railway station, and suddenly there comes up a whole bunch of about 100 black uniformed thugs with black body armor, heavily armed, and they all have Homeland Security on their back. They were all mestizo, by the way. Almost every one of them was a mestizo, and they're clumping around heavily with their hefty boots. And I was thinking, this is unthinkable. I thought America was a democracy. 30 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to have a domestic armed force with weapons calling themselves a security unit and clumping around a railway station, a sort of civilian facility. But now people have got used to that there's going to be this government body with nebulous role and with immense powers of arrest, and they're going to be armed and they're going to walk around intimidating us. But that is a sign that the occupation has become more open and has hardened, and that their rulers are tightening their grip. And of course, it's in the name of confronting some external threat. It's always in the name of some external enemy. That's how they do it. That's how the regime in Egypt justifies its existence. They're doing security against some vague external enemy. How does that make sense to you, any of it?
Yes, absolutely, Frank. And it's interesting when you look at the parallels you said about the Oklahoma City bombing of, we know that was not a truck bomb. I mean, I could see that for myself just from what I used to see of footage of IRA bombings in the UK when I grew up. It was, obvious the building had been blown outward, not something from the outside causing that sort of damage. But the interesting point that you made is that resulted in the destruction of the American militia movement. And when you talk about the Department of Homeland Security, they only really came along after 9/11, another questionable event that doesn't seem to be at all like what they say it is officially, and it seems to have been a lot more of a sort of controlled demolition, that sort of thing. We won't get into it here, but you can see how they've used two so-called terror attacks to ramp up the draconian regime against the American people. And of course we had the Patriot Act, which was a lengthy document that was basically ready to go pretty much as soon as the attack happened. So obviously had been put together long before that. Back to you, Frank.
Yeah, everything you said is absolutely right. It's part of a larger pattern all over the world. I grew up watching the Pakistan regime, the military regime in Pakistan. It justified all its repressive measures by claiming that India, a foreign power, is the enemy. It's the Indians that are the threat. And that justified them. And that's what's happening with 9/11 and Oklahoma. They all, well, 9/11 particularly, they say there's an external enemy. And they use that excuse to put their heavy hand on the necks of the people. So, the occupiers, another marker or characteristic of occupation is that the occupiers control the wealth of the country. They control the wealth of society. It concentrates in their hands. And feudal lords certainly did that. What made a feudal lord so powerful? He grabbed 1/3 of the produce of his tenant farmers, of the subjects, and he had that wealth in his hands. The Norman king, for example, Richard II, he controlled the wealth of the Saxons, and one day he said, I think I'll just invade Ireland and try to conquer the Irish. But he used the wealth of his occupied people, the Saxons, to do it. Now today, the sneak rulers control the wealth of most of these countries through ownership of the major banks, through Wall Street, through hedge funds, even the major insurance companies, but most of all through the Federal Reserve. With the Federal Reserve, they can print money and grab a larger proportion of a bigger share of the public wealth. Suddenly, instead of 5% of the public wealth, they now control 10% just by printing more money, by having a larger amount of the money. Whites, even the white elite, have very little control over the money flows and the resources of their countries. And by controlling this wealth, the occupation renders whites in a very powerless situation. The whites have no control over their destinies. For example, I'd urge people to watch a program by Tucker Carlson called What is Wrong with Rural America? It turns out that very powerful hedge funds, Wall Street hedge funds, can target a thriving community and take its assets and export the jobs overseas, spin off the jobs, close down the factories, and outsource the jobs, and the entire community collapses. Whole towns become ghost towns. Now, any white looking at that should kind of worry and say, how come we aren't able to organize our societies? How come these things are happening and we are powerless to do it? How come entire towns are becoming ghost towns? Now, I was only today watching a program on YouTube. This fellow is driving through 4 states, among them Louisiana and Texas, and looks at entirely empty towns. The city, everything is there: the police station, city hall, the old bar, the hair salon, the rusted machinery, the rusting cars. This video is called "The Empty Towns and Villages of Louisiana," and the same person has made another video exploring forgotten towns in northern Texas. Now, white people have always wanted to live close to the earth. They've always wanted small towns and communities, but the people at the top, the people controlling Washington, they have enacted policies, especially globalized free trade, that has destroyed that and forced the whites into the cities, where they're totally unhappy. They're as unhappy as a tiger of the forest is when caged in a zoo. And being unhappy, they have turned to things like OxyContin, and we have an opioid crisis. We have whites who are so depressed that they have unprecedented rates of suicide, and only among whites. The suicide rate has risen only for whites. And that's actually true in all the white countries. Now, any awake white person should think, what is going on? At one time, why are people depressed and feeling a state of helplessness? Now, at one time, the Russians were occupied people. They were occupied by the Bolshevik Jews. Later, they were occupied and ruled by their successors, Russian people, Russian individuals who mistakenly believed in communism. The Brezhnev era was that. Russians who had been cadres of the Bolshevik Jews, ethnic Russians, took over the reins of power, and they actually believed in communism, and they also enjoyed the privileges of being commissars. But the Russian people reacted to that. Their helplessness, their frustration at being an occupied people, the people who cannot improve their conditions, who cannot live the way they like, was to be the most alcoholic people on earth. Alcoholism was the bane of all of Russia and Ukraine. Now that should wake up anyone and say, alcoholism, drugs, depression, suicide, aren't these the indicators of an occupied people? A people who were once vibrant, who built communities in vast virgin territories, who want to live close to the earth, who want to be manufacturing people. And now their towns and villages have been closed down. Their manufacturing facilities are rusting away. And if they can get a job at all, they're getting a job as a hamburger flipper. Isn't that the sign of a people that's lost control of its destiny and is under alien occupation? I think, it's time for educated whites to shake their heads and look at this situation and say, why aren't we able to act as our ancestors acted, improving ourselves, making the right decisions? What do you say, Andy?
Well, Frank, what it reminds me of, it just jumped into my mind that second, and that was that meme that went around, hashtag it's okay to be white, and how this was trotted out there by the mainstream as this is racist, it's racist. So when you actually analyse that, it's very difficult. What you're saying is it's not okay to be white, because if you've got a problem with someone saying that, and that proves that there is an all-out assault on white people, so you can't even say something like that, I think that the mainstream would have been best to leave that one alone. But I think they're so on edge, trying to crack down here, there and everywhere on people, that they can't allow any dissent out there, but then that ends up showing their hand. So I agree with you, people should look for the indicators. And I think what you said about the alcoholism in Russia and Ukraine, that is very well documented. And that is something that we're seeing an increase of with the drug addiction, the Oxycontin. You look at these towns like in Appalachia that used to have all their, coal mining and different things like that. We had a similar thing in the UK when Thatcher supposedly was, getting rid of the coal industry. So all these towns around the north of England, basically that was what they depended on. Most of the men there were coal miners, and suddenly they were told you don't have a job anymore. And then you look at these towns today, and you've got two generations that have never worked. And again, you've got rife alcoholism and drug addiction. And the same with the Oxycontin in Appalachia and other areas of America where they've been deindustrialized. So I think it's a clear plan. And as you say, people need to wake up to it. Otherwise, they will not survive, to paraphrase the words of someone else.
Precisely. I couldn't have put it better myself, Andy. I think you've summed it up pretty good there. Now, occupied people are never allowed to speak for their group interest. They cannot have freedom of speech on their group interest. That's so with every occupied people. For example, when the Turks occupied Egypt and Ukraine, they didn't allow their subject peoples to speak for their group interest. Now, whites, of course, have that problem. They are not able to speak for their group interest. And there's many ways that's done. For example, through law, straight up law, which means the occupiers, as usual, have seized the lever of government. They actually control the government. So everywhere there are these hate crime laws, which basically says that if a white cannot say anything that might offend someone of another race. So even on the matter of immigration, if a white says that I don't want immigration from colored people or from third world countries, good God, they might be offended. Well, what about the whites who are being offended? Their concerns don't count. They're an inferior people. It's the superior alien who might be offended. So that's obvious. There are laws in Britain, particularly. I think the laws are very draconian. And it's a funny thing that George Orwell, in his book 1984, said that it's always the women, so some women anyway, who are the most fanatic enforcers of orthodoxy, who sniff around and say, well, I'm virtuous and I found this person to be a Eurasian spy or a East Asian spy, or I found this person to be saying something against Big Brother. In England, there was a case where a man said something in a library to another man about the fact that his town was becoming full of coloreds. And there was a woman librarian who was behind some shelves of books, and she overheard it. And she, like any keen, virtuous sneak and toady, reported them to the thought police, and they were prosecuted. Well, that's pretty interesting, right? But it's not just through the law that whites are not allowed to speak for their group interest. It's through media exclusion. Whenever there are, there's rape of whites on a mass scale in America, 20,000 white women are raped every year by blacks. In England, you had the rape epidemics at Rotherham and other cities, not just Rotherham. But the media excludes that. They don't mention it. And often it's in the name of shutting down hate. The media excludes any mention of white interests, and they're pretty open about it. About a year ago, the CNN had a program called Network of Hate or something like that. I watched that program, and the program ended with saying that we got to shut down this terrible hate by white supremacists. So the ADL, and they put up the face of Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the ADL, looking particularly cold and dangerous. And he said that the ADL is working with Google, Apple, and other such tech giants to remove hate speech from the internet by means of software. We don't even need a human being to do it. The software will detect the hate speech and it'll be suppressed. It'll just be deleted from Facebook, YouTube, wherever you like. So whites are not able to speak for their group interest, and it's just the same as in any occupation. But then there's also media intimidation and ridicule. For example, a Canadian wrote in the social media that he was sick of being exploited by the native Indians, of having to pay heavy taxes to feed and house and buy cars and housing for the native Indians, and all the time they're belly aching of the evil of the whites, of colonialism and exploitation. Well, the media tarred and feathered him, and he lost his job as a teacher. He was sort of public enemy number one for a few days on the media. So there are various ways by which whites are prevented from speaking for their group interests, of their problems, and that, if nothing else, that should tell you that whites are an occupied people. They are gagged people, as well gagged as any prisoner in a jail who's being obstreperous. The jailers say, put a gag on him. Okay? And this, of course, brings up the issue that the media serves the rulers and their colonists. The media doesn't serve the occupied, never. In the Middle Ages, the town crier was the media. And the town crier would go up into the town square and shout out in a loud voice, it is now announced that the food ration is blah, or the taxes, or the Duke wants this or that. And today the town crier is the media. But both the private enterprise media and the government media serve the sneak rulers and the colonists. I don't have to tell you that the BBC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, they all serve the colonization of their country, and they all denigrate white people. I don't have to tell you that. I'll give you just one example that there was this woman, a black woman in America called Tawana Bradley. And Tawana Bradley came out and said that she was beaten and raped by 4 or 5 white men and covered with feces by them, and they put her in a plastic bag, in a garbage bag, to proclaimed to the world that she was garbage. Well, the media instantly jumped on it and made a cause célèbre. Oh, those wicked whites. And that's where Al Sharpton, the race hustler, got his start. He became the champion of Tawana Bradley in the face of these wicked whites. Well, it turned out that that was a hoax. All of it was a lie. And suddenly the media lost interest in the story. Suddenly it wasn't big news. It didn't serve the colonization. It didn't serve the sneak rulers. And the funny thing is that Al Sharpton was not punished. He was rewarded, and he became a big public figure. And all this is the doing of the media. On the other hand, when there was the infamous Wichita massacre of 2000, I think it was 2000, I can't be sure now, where a couple of blacks barged into a household, 3 white men and 2 white women, terrorized them through a day and a night, raped the women and sodomized them, tried to force the men to sodomize each other, eventually took them to a snowy field naked, made them kneel naked in the snow, and shot them. Only one woman survived the shooting. She ran naked through the snow for help. Those blacks actually then went back to the house to steal more, and they shot the dog. But that never appeared in the national media. It appeared in the local media, but never in the national media. So the media, that's a marker of occupation, that the media serves the rulers and their colonists. It doesn't serve the occupied subject people. Now, that should also tell you that whites are a subject people. Your response, sir?
Yes, I mean, it's so obvious. There are so many examples. That's a quite harrowing one. And then we had the something that happened in Knoxville, Tennessee, where Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom were basically tortured and raped and what have you by blacks, and that was largely unreported as well. And but what did get reported was a rally that white people had to highlight the case. Of course, that was declared racist. And then you could look at things like that Catholic school in America about this sort of time last year, Frank, you know, where that Native American Indian confronted this schoolboy, let's get it right, a schoolboy, a child in a MAGA hat, and then the newspapers were all saying how racist and this person's got such a punchable face and we need to do this, that and the other. And then it was found that it was actually this guy and these so-called black Israelites that were actually terrorising them and were threatening them and were swearing at them. And again, the media lost all interest and they didn't follow up on the case. So it's very obvious what's going on. It's just a shame that there aren't too many white people that, you know, are speaking out about it, or maybe they are so dumbed down by the diet of the television and all the other things, as you say, that they're turning to try and distract themselves from this problem, that they just don't say anything about it. And unfortunately, that's going to mean that they're going to be participating in their own destruction, Frank.
Absolutely. Now, but you'll agree with my point that if an educated, reasonably intelligent person saw that the media doesn't serve us, it's against us, and it serves alien peoples, then we must be an occupied people. We have lost one of the major levers of power in our society, and that major lever is being used against us. He has to say, I must be in an inferior subject occupied position. Now, well, that's of course a big issue. But let's move on to the fact that occupied people cannot act for their group interest. They cannot speak for their group interest. They cannot act for it either. For example, if someone wanted an all-white school in Britain or in France, you can't have it. And when whites try to get an all-white school, a school of their people, where their children can be taught by their people and read their history and learn their culture, they have to ask for a neighborhood school. They have to dog whistle. Instead of speaking frankly, saying, I want my kid to go to school with other whites, he has to say, well, I want a neighborhood school, meaning of my neighborhood, which is a white neighborhood. But then that won't last because you can't even have a white neighborhood. If you have a white neighborhood, they have policies against that. Obama had a war on white suburbs, saying that if you see too many whites, you got to wipe that out. You got to throw in a few blacks. You got to punish it with some punitive tax law. There is definite campaigns against white neighborhoods. In fact, I doubt that the aim of the present regime of this program of destruction is that whites cannot have even one community center, one street, one neighborhood, one school for themselves. There are people who not only cannot have a country, self-determination, and of course that's the mark of occupation, that you cannot have self-determination. You cannot live among your people. You cannot live on a parcel of land. You cannot have your own government. You cannot determine your own destiny. And for example, the British in India said, no, you're not going to have your own government. You can't. And not only can white people not have a country, they can't even have one street to themselves. They'll be hunted down to the last street, to the last neighborhood. So that's a big interest that they cannot act for. They're not allowed to act for it. But they cannot act against the abortion of white babies, for example. If some white guy said that our birth rate is declining, I don't want abortion, he is not allowed to say that. He'll be called a racist, so he takes refuge in religion and says, it's for religion or it's for family values. And they form an organization like Focus on the Family, which really wants to prevent abortion of white babies, but can't say so. So I'm just promoting family values. And then you think of the ultimate, that you cannot even think of a program for promoting white births and white babies. White people are told endlessly that you're not having enough children, you're not replacing your population, so who's going to take care of you in your old age in the old age home, in the hospitals? Who's going to grow the crops? So we have to bring in aliens. And of course, the white liberal repeats that. It says, look, we are not having babies, we have no choice. We got to bring in these Arabs and Turks and Jamaicans. But then someone says, well, if you're not having babies, let's have a program to have white babies. Oh, no, that would be racist, that would be Nazi. That reminds us of those wicked Nazis and their Lebensborn program. Oh, no, we can't have that, that's white supremacism. In fact, there was now I recall, in California, sometime in the 90s, I believe, there was a woman called Christine Greenwood who started something in her basement called Aryan Baby Drive. That's what she called it, Aryan Baby Drive. And she was collecting donations of clothes and toys for poor white children, for poor white families, so that their babies would have little prams and cots and rockers and toys. And she was actually prosecuted. She wasn't going out beating up anyone or killing anyone. She was trying to promote white births, and she was prosecuted for that. Christine Greenwood, Aryan Baby Drive. Now, if that doesn't tell you that you're not only occupied but slated for occupation, what else will? There is no politician in any white country who can say that we white people are having less babies and this is being used as a lever for more colonization. Let's have white babies. Let's have a government program for that. Can you even imagine, Andy, anyone bringing forward such a proposal?
Absolutely not. It's interesting because it reminds me of a similar case, Frank. In South Africa, I had a lady on a couple of years ago, and she had a project to raise money for homeless white people and children especially. The drive at Christmas was to buy Christmas presents for these white children that were in shanty towns and what have you, and she had her PayPal account closed down, so she wasn't able to raise money for presents for these children. And this is the sort of thing that we see going on all over the place. We've only got a minute left, so I'll hand back to you to close out the show with any final comments, please, Frank.
Well, we couldn't cover the entire gamut. Maybe we can have another show. But since we have only a minute left, just remember that the occupied people are always disarmed. in most of the white countries, they're already disarmed. But in the one country where the revolutionaries were very conscious of freedom and and introduced the Second Amendment, there are absolutely a vigorous campaign to disarm the whites. And whenever someone tries to disarm a population, be sure of it that they want to tighten the occupation and make sure that the subject peoples don't dare revolt.
Thank you so much, Frank. Fantastic information. I've wanted to get Frank onto this program for such a long time, and I'm delighted to have finally been able to do so. And I'll certainly be asking him after we close out this show to join me again, and we can continue this fantastic discussion. Frank, I understand you're going to be on with Bryza as well on Monday, aren't you, on the Graham Hart Show? Is that correct?
Yes, indeed.
Excellent. So, folks, you know Graham Hart and Bryza are good friends of mine, and Frank is always a fantastic guest. So make sure that you catch that on Monday. I want to thank all of you for listening. I want to thank Frank for joining me. It's the weekend tomorrow, so have a wonderful weekend. I'll be back with you all on Monday, and until then, folks, bye for now.